Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Esper, for inviting me to present. I'm not going to present. I don't have a presentation, I should say. I was hoping it would be more for a dialogue, because I was asked to provide commentary on the various elements, that are currently before you, and especially in light of the fact that transformation is extremely topical at the moment, and I was asked to talk about, how can we meaningfully advance transformation, and that transformation is by design rather than something that happens or is outsourced. So when we look at transformation, the question is, why do we need to have transformation? And what does it impact? It matters to have meaningful transformation because it influences how decisions are made, who's included in the decision-making process and the outcomes. And McKinsey's produced various studies, as have others, that diversity adds to the bottom line due to the benefit of diversity. And transformation ought to happen by design. It's not something that can be outsourced. And if you look at the telecoms framework as far back as the Telecoms Act, you'd note that a key element of transformation is that it needed to be reflective in all aspects of the ecosystem and businesses. And it also includes a mandatory requirement. So in the ICT sector, particularly when it comes to licensees, there are two sets of obligations that you need to comply with. One is the ECA, that if you hold an individual license, it prescribes a mandatory requirement. Then if you have a class license, what it does is it has an obligation of compliance in terms of the ownership and control regulations, which speaks to a level 4 of compliance. And in addition to, even if you had the ownership requirement, you still had to comply with the codes. Because in terms of the B-BBEE Act, any organ of state granting a license or a concession needs to consider what is, the status and the level of compliance in terms of the codes, which is what ICASA does. And so ICASA integrates the two fairly efficiently, I guess. And then we know that in terms of the B-BBEE Act, we know there's a transformation fund that's been introduced, and there's been an amendment to the codes, and that process is underway. We know that the BEE Commission has said in the media that they are looking at the review of the B-BBEE framework, the legislative framework that is, and we know that the ICT Sector Council has begun the process to review the ICT Sector Code. So there are the two parts. So let's start by unpacking the ICASA framework. So the ICASA framework says that any individual license has a 30% HDI requirement. And there's a distinction between HDI and BEE. So HDI is a bit broader than BEE. Then in terms of class licenses, ICASA began a process in 2017 where they started with a discussion document, and based on the commentary, they developed a regulation that says that you need to adopt a more responsive or flexible approach when it comes to smaller licensees, class licensees. And as I understand it, many many ISPs fall within that category. And the requirement in terms of the regulations is a level 4 in terms of compliance. So if you're a QSE with a turnover of under 20 million, then you're required to comply with the QSE scorecard. And you need 80 points out of 120 points to qualify for a level 4. And there are 82 points in that scorecard. So then when it comes to I guess one of the more topical issues in terms of the EEIP, or Equity Equivalent Investment Policy Directive that the minister issued during last year, where he'd consulted on it and then he issued the policy direction to ICASA. So what happens there is you have ICASA that has to consider. ICASA is not required to simply comply. So they've received the policy direction, they're considering it, and as I understand it, they are substantially far in the process in terms of responding to the minister. So there are two things. The first is, what happens if they decide to, if they agree with the policy direction? So they can either agree with it and implement it, or they can disagree with it, but you can't disagree with it arbitrarily. Instead, they would have to, if they disagree with it, they would have to go back to the minister with the rationale, and it has to be a sound rationale to say, I'm not going to comply with the policy direction, and this is why. And if they agree with it, what will happen is they would then have to amend their regulations, and that would be a process. It's not something that would happen immediately. And if they, assuming that they agree with it and they implement it, what it means is, and I've seen various discussions on this where people seem to have different ideas. So an EEIP, by its very nature and the way that it's structured in the B-BBEE Act, is that you have, it applies only to multinationals that have never divested shareholding in any jurisdiction. So if you're a multinational that has done an equity deal in another country, you don't qualify. So effectively today, none of our multinational partners that have licenses in the country would be able to switch to an EEIP. This is only for that very small subset of licensees that have never done this. And what it would mean if ICASA wouldn't just simply be able to apply the EEIPs. They would have to apply the codes. And then there would have to be some sort of process that negates the 30% that currently is in the ECA. And that's subject to interpretation because you have two schools of thought. The one school of thought is that you don't, the ECA doesn't compel you to do the 30%, but there's equally a judgment that tells us that you have to do the 30%. So the thing is that what it would mean is, instead of if, and this is a big if ICASA were to adopt the application of the codes instead of the HDI requirement, what that means is that your compliance with the code is what ICASA would consider. So you wouldn't automatically have to do the 30% HDI, but you would have to do equity in terms of the codes. And if you, just as a reminder in case people aren't aware of it, so if you have a generic if you're a generic entity, that means your turnover is 50 million or more, then that means you have to comply with the full scorecard. If your turnover is between 20 and 50, then you would comply with the QSE scorecard, which means you are measured on 4 elements. And that would be the process that ICASA would adopt. And the way that it works at the moment is that you would only have the process of looking at the EEIPs currently apply to any multinational that doesn't have a license. the effect of the policy direction, if ICASA adopts it, is it may be adopted in terms of licenses. But if you ask me, I don't know how practical that is and if that's really going to happen. What we do know is the ECA is going to be amended, and that provides an opportunity for people to comment. And the reality is, in as much as the ECA may have specific areas for commentary, it doesn't mean that that's the limitation on commentary. It could be broadened, which is usually what happens. Then the second part of it is when it comes to, there are two parts, like I said. So we know that there's the BEE legislative framework that falls under the DTIC. So you have the transformation fund that would sit directly under DTIC, and then you have the legislative framework that sits under the commission. So we know that earlier this year, there was I think it was about January, that the DTIC published an amendment to one of the statements, or multiple statements that all give effect to the transformation fund, which would then have a knock-on effect of being incorporated into sector codes. What they were trying to do there is create a framework for the transformation fund. And when you have the transformation fund, people are being incentivized to contribute to the sector fund, where you get additional points, and there's a percentage. So this is still being discussed, so I don't know how it's exactly going to turn out. But we've seen, based on the drive, there's a very distinct and rapid drive towards the creation of the transformation fund, which is supposed to rack up 100 billion. Part of the discussions around that relates to the fact that you want to ring fence funds for the sector. So, you don't want ICT firms to be putting in money into the transformation fund and then it gets used on construction or something outside of the sector. You want it to come back to the sector. Otherwise, it becomes a general tax and it's not a meaningful thing. And the reality is that there are lots of concerns. I know the DTIC is pushing ahead with this, but there are lots of concerns from other people because we don't have a rich history of funds that work very well. We also don't have a rich history of when something's not working that we say, okay, we acknowledge it, we take stock, and we take it back. We find multiple ways, even if it takes 30 years and it doesn't work, we keep trying to fix, and it's an iterative process, and it goes into this black pool. And because this is a choice that people have, you have a choice to contribute to the fund, or you have a choice to roll out. And again, this only applies to multinationals. What they're trying to do is broaden it. That instead of doing an EEIP, you pay somebody, and they would be able to roll out an EEIP effectively and provide funding to black businesses. So the premise of what they're trying to do is not necessarily wrong, because black business does have a more difficult time attracting funding, because you don't necessarily have access to various other things, and so that's an issue. So this is my view, that what they should do is look at how do you address the funding, and there are multiple ways that you could do this without necessarily creating this fund. And if you do, the question is, how does it become efficient? So people have the option to either contribute to the fund or roll out. I mean, based on the history of funds, I wouldn't be putting my money in that fund. Because you also have much more control if you're the one rolling it out. And I think it makes a big difference. And the reason that this session was titled Transformation by Design is because the only way we're going to have meaningful transformation is not if we outsource it to somebody else. It's got to be effective in all businesses. And it's got to be reflective throughout the business at all levels. But also, we can't only be trying to get into current businesses. We've also got to start creating new businesses that address transformation. And in that regard, what we should be doing is looking at specific areas where that may necessarily be earmarked, and you build resources, you build, sorry, I don't know this thing, am I at 29 minutes? Is my time up?
No,
Oh.
29 minutes.
Oh, okay, thank you. So, it's supposed to be, transformation is meant to be by design. So there are two components. One is you do want to be incorporated. You do want to see transformation in existing businesses. And the reason for that is because it influences the direction of the business. It influences the decision making. It increases diversity. And the research shows us that it increases the bottom line. But we also acknowledge that there may be businesses that, for whatever reason, maybe it's a family-owned business and you're not going to be doing meaningful transformation and you're just ticking a box. Now, that's not a useful exercise, which is why when it comes to smaller businesses, the codes provide for an allowance where you're a QSE, you can decide what you're going to comply with and which elements. So you do have that option. And there is that kind of flexibility, and it depends on where you sit on the spectrum that BEE legislation is either well crafted or for others it's not mandatory enough. I sit on the side of the scale where I believe it's a good way of regulating because it's an incentive rather than a punitive arrangement. So if you don't want to comply, that's your choice. But you certainly benefit from complying rather than having to pay a penalty. And so we need to look at it from that perspective. And yes, it does become a bit more tricky if you want a license because then there are more specific requirements that people have to comply with. We also know, like I said, the ECA is being amended. Then there's the ICT code that's being reviewed by the B-BBEE ICT Sector Council. So the first is that we need to look at that process, and comments, I think, close on the 20th of May. So if it's not enough time, I suggest you write and request an extension. So here's what they are asking for, and it's quite a nice way of regulating. They're saying to you, tell me what your issues are in terms of the implementation of the codes. Tell me what your pain points are. If you have data to support it, provide the data to me. If it's confidential data, tell me that it's confidential and request confidentiality on it. And finally, tell me how you would resolve that issue. So what they are doing is they will then have an engagement with people in terms of the process and the comments they've received. From there, they will then develop an amended draft code, which everyone would have the opportunity to comment on. And with that code, they would also give you the opportunity to simply, they'd give you the code and they'll give you a reasons document, which explains why they've made the choices they've made, so that it allows people to comment in a meaningful way. So you understand what they were trying to do, and if you think they've missed the mark, you would be able to engage with them to say, this is how I think you can better address it. So that's a nice collaborative way of participating in terms of the process. You would have the opportunity to do that. The code's been amended twice before, and that hasn't necessarily been the process that was followed. Then we know that ICASA adopts an approach of, they did the draft regulations. When they published it, they give you an opportunity and a period to comply. And if you're still having challenges, what you have to do is approach ICASA to say, look, this is what it is, and this is how you engage on it. So I think I will pause there, and if you want to do questions rather than me trying to predict. Is that fine? Oh, it was like, should I sit or stand?
Thank you so much. If anyone has questions for Katharina, I think we can take them now. You can come up to the microphone.
Good morning, former Councillor Pillay. This is former Councillor Stuckey.
Good morning, former councillor.
B-BBEE has been a hopeless failure. Inequality has increased. All it has done has made a few well-connected people richer. And it has made rich or very rich. And it has made the cost of government services on average 25% higher. There's lots of research to support that. Your comments?
Should I say I did miss you? So I think that is a subject for debate. And I think we need to be honest and go back and look at history. If we didn't have an issue and if we didn't have exclusion of women, of specific groups, of black people, we wouldn't have to create a platform for redress. And the reality is in any environment, and let's be fair, transformation is not something that's unique to South Africa. It's applied in many, many countries. The reality is that you don't throw it out. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it does need to be looked. I mean, you'd look at it towards fixing it, but I don't believe that you can simply remove it. And I don't think it's always been applied effectively, but equally, I don't think it's only enriched just a few. Yes, it may have made some people significantly richer than others, but I think it's also created a platform to allow for the inclusion of more people. Because in as much as corporate and lots of businesses will tell you that they are so altruistic and we do everything for the greater good, take away the regulations, I don't think it necessarily, you don't necessarily see the proliferation of inclusion of various groups without it. So I believe we need it. But I think we need to make sure that it works in a meaningful way. And what we need to do is move away from tick box exercises to impact. This is like being at school and you put on,
Hi, Graham from the internet. I was going to say something along the lines of what William was going to say, but a little bit less William. I do get a sense that within the current frameworks, there's a big focus towards sort of ticking the box at ownership and equity first and kind of just dodging everything else. And it concerns me that within the current ICASA framework, obviously ICASA is busy rethinking what they're doing, but they seem to be very focused on the equity and the ownership. And I sort of support what William is saying, that I feel like it has been a contributing factor to the inequality, and maybe we should lower the weighting of that much lower, maybe all the way to zero, and focus on the other things that are more genuinely broad-based, because I'm also concerned that things have centralized around people who potentially politically connected or connected in various ways, and it hasn't had the broad transformation that we would like to see. But what knobs do we tweak? Is it that we just take the weighting of that one right down, or is there something else that we should do to broaden it in the way that it's broadening inequality as much as it's broadening restoration from the past?
Oh, this is a tough crowd today. So here's the thing. I believe that you must have equity. And it's not the only element. So when ICASA is looking at the policy direction that the ministers issued, then it doesn't mean they're going to necessarily take away equity. ICASA does what's in the Act. And the ECA has a mandatory requirement for equity, as it did in the Telecommunications Act. So I think that we need to take a step back, which is part of the reason that the BEE Commission is reviewing the code, because you need it to be broad-based. I mean, sorry, not the code, the whole legislative framework. And I think it's very important that people comment there. And so we need to look at it. So there have been two steps in transformation. The first was where you had narrow-based transformation. Narrow-based transformation relied on the acquisition of equity. What that did was exactly what you're saying. And I think the mistake we make sometimes is we conflate that with just BE, because the reality is, look across the globe. Whoever comes in, you typically see the enrichment of those cronies, right? So let's not pretend that that doesn't exist. And that's how we saw the first empowerment deals. But the value of broad-based black economic empowerment is you have things like indirect ownership schemes. They're not all equal. Some have been a dismal failure. Some have worked better. So what we need to do is learn and understand what are those success factors, what are those things. You know, in the early 2000s, when the ICT sector code charter was first promulgated, people started rushing around to do B deals, you know, especially the indirect shareholding. So what they did is they discounted the shares. I may have spent 1,000 Rand to acquire shares. And then in the ones that were done well, you received dividends after a period while the capital grew. And I may have invested 1,000 Rand, and the dividends, or maybe 10,000 Rand or whatever it is, and the dividends that I received annually, it may not be a lot in the grand scheme of things, but it may be enough for me to pay school fees for my child. It may be enough for me to pay varsity fees. Just that alone, the impact of that is that it changes the life and the dynamic of my family. It's the same thing that happened with employee share schemes. It meant that people that didn't historically have legacy funds or anything inherited are now acquiring something that they can then pass on. So that has an impact. But again, it all depends on how well or how badly we do it. So the question is that we need to look at it from that perspective. And these are some of the things that I think we need to look at. Like, for example, you know, we've seen lots of articles in the media where somebody says, oh, I've trained 1 million people. I'm so happy that you've trained 1 million people. But those 1 million people, what was the training? Was it a day? Was it a skill, a real skill that helps them seek employment? So while equity is one component, and I do think that equity is important, but not just the inclusion of only elites and people that are connected, that's just wrong. There are additional elements that the code tries to drive now. It's the inclusion of women, it's the inclusion of people that hadn't done deals before, those kinds of things. I'm not necessarily saying it's all perfect, and that's why commentary is important. The second part is, so there are 3 priority areas. One is equity, which we talked about. The second is skills development, which is very important because that impacts who then goes into things like management and control, which also impacts your business. And procurement is another important thing because then that begins to create other businesses in the pipeline. And sometimes people conflate mediocrity with BE. That's not what it's about. The reality is you're looking for the best candidate in a specific pool, and you do want to create an environment that that is reflective of the demographics, because it's not sustainable in South Africa or anywhere else to have management and ownership of an economy that doesn't reflect the demographics of the country. So I hope I answered your question.
May I please join the frame?
You may.
My name is Mxoleli Nkuhlu. I'm standing just to add value to the response that you have just given to the issue at hand. And my plea being the following, madam, that perhaps we need to be more circumspect as we consider this issue, such that we make an effort to look at it from the perspective of those that it is intended to help out of a quagmire, so to speak, such that it does not become the preserve of those that have had this benefit for ages, who express a view as to how it ought to be dealt with. The matter need not be overly politicized for present purposes. I mean, there's a particular objective for the week that we are going through as ISPA, but it would have been a disservice to have sat in this environment and not come up and state the fact that there is still ample room for improvement in how BEE is implemented without throwing the baby with the bathwater. Thanks, madam.
Thank you for that. I think that's actually very important. So, Councillor Stuckey chose to out me that I used to be a regulator, but the reality is, very often in these discussions, you have the voices of corporates, you have the voices of regulators, you have the voices of all kinds of different people, but you don't have the person on the ground like you're talking about. And the question is, how do you mobilize that kind of commentary to make sure that it's included in terms of the voices, and because I think it's a very important point that you raise. Thank you.
Anne Brooks from ISPA. I have a bit of soapboxing and a question. The soapboxing, I think the single biggest thing ICASA could do to improve transformation of license holders is give new individual licenses to the already black-owned businesses and operators that currently cannot get them for no rational reason. And then the question, it seemed that you weren't convinced that ICASA was going to follow the ministerial directive to align the license conditions to the general B-BBEE requirements. What happens if ICASA doesn't? Where does that leave us? Would you want to paint a hypothetical scenario about what might happen next?
This is me. This has nothing to do with what ICASA is actually going to do. I don't work for them. This is just my view. So you have the ECA. The ECA says that you... Is this recorded? Okay. So then you're going to get that answer. So there's the ECA. The ECA says that you have 30%, and 9(2)B of the ECA says that you either have 30% in 30% HDI in an individual license, or such other higher percentage, or other conditions. So some people read the or other conditions as being that you can apply the codes instead of the 30%. I understand it differently. I understand that the 30% is mandatory for an individual license in addition to the codes, because that's what the B-BBEE Act says. And ICASA is a creature of statute, and they've got to implement what's before them. And the policy direction is effectively saying, set aside 9(2)B, and we'll use the or other such conditions. And the or other such conditions says that we will only apply the codes. And I don't think that's necessarily going to work, And also, it's not the silver bullet that people seem to think it is, because it changes nothing for any of the existing licensees. All that it does is that instead of you having the license requirement of 30%, you may have 20%, and that's your choice. But the B-BBEE codes also has a sub-minimum. So if you don't achieve 40%, you drop a level, and that only applies to companies over 50 million. So this is just me. They could surprise me, and they could come along and say, hey, we're going to do the EEIPs. I don't necessarily think that the ECA is going to be amended to remove the 30%. I could be completely wrong. I could be misreading it, but based on everything you've seen in the media, I would be surprised if the mandatory requirement is removed. I was looking at the architect of the Telecoms Act and the ECA, that had included the transformation. And he's just sitting there kind of blending into the room. Okay, he's not commenting. Continue.
Okay, it's Sarah Jane here. I think from my side, I'd just like to appeal to members and everybody in the audience to take this opportunity to hear what Katharina had to say, that we are being asked as a community and as the sector to comment on the current codes, to highlight what doesn't work. It's all very well coming up and saying, transformation is a problem and ownership is a problem. But if we can go back and say, these are the problems and here are the solutions, I think we can have a big impact on how the codes are formed. So I just wanted to reiterate that. Thanks.
Oh, I was just leaving prematurely.
Hello, I'm Max. I come from Italy originally, and I live in Switzerland. In Italy, there is just a registration. There's no license required. You send a letter. If you don't get an answer back in 60 days, you're an operator. You're a registered operator. In Switzerland, I started my own network. I sent I called the local, the cantonal office for telecoms, and they told me, oh, we don't do that anymore. We don't need registration, so just run your network. I used to work at Internet Society, where one of my duties, one of the things I did was work in the community networks and helping people across the world set up community networks. And one of the recommendations that we always issued was to all the governments and all the organizations was do not create barriers. Just to let people start running networks or doing things, because otherwise there will be problems. And this is also my suggestion today. So sorry if this comes as a hard thing, but creating barriers doesn't help usually.
I don't think it comes to the hard thing. So there are two parts to it. One is in terms of the way the license framework is structured. So the license, the ECA was promulgated in, 2005? At that time, it was based on a managed liberalized framework. And the architect's sitting here, and he can speak to it better than I can. But the reality is, at that time, you had to be resident in South Africa. So that framework doesn't work anymore. Today, you have, a very different environment in which you operate. But I don't think those things are mutually exclusive. I think you can still do transformation, because I think transformation matters. But equally, I think you can allow people to come into the environment without necessarily all of the barriers. Like, sorry, I forget. Oh, it was I forget who asked the question about the licensing. The reality is that in 2005, You couldn't just come into the market. You needed a policy direction. At that time, in terms of the individual licenses, it was never envisaged that you'd have 400. But the reality is, with the LTEC judgment, you ended up with 400. So that provision makes absolutely no sense anymore. What we've recommended to the ministry for maybe more than a decade now is leave it as open-ended, that anyone can come in, because all they've done is create a secondary market. And it's an unintended consequence in the sense that instead of going to ICASA and doing the registration, because that's effectively what it is today, and you should be allowed to apply for scarce resources. You should look at that differently. But at the same time, I mean, really, what does the license mean? You have the regulations that you can have people comply with. But to get in, today you have to go and buy an existing license. All that it does is it makes somebody rich for no reason other than the fact that that person happened to have a van's license that was converted into an individual license, and they did whatever it's taken, which is minimal at best, to keep that license alive, to simply sell it for a quick payday. I wish I thought about that, and I, had that crystal ball. But there's so many people, and it's an unintended, unnecessary consequence. And the challenge with that is, for me, that you've been in an environment for over 10 years where the priority project has been to reduce the cost to communicate. You keep putting all these pressures, but you've got this unnecessary barrier. I mean, how much of an effort is it to simply remove that and allow anyone to acquire a license? So I support that.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Oh, well, I decided.